She smiled that dangerous smile, and everything else disappeared. Captain Mara Jenkins stood at the helm of the Terran Exploration Fleet's flagship, the Conqueror, staring out at the swirling colors of the Nix system through the observation window. The stars seemed to dance and pulse as the ship made its way toward the mysterious planet below. Nix had been hidden for centuries, a world that no one had dared to explore. Until now. Humanity had expanded across the galaxy, but the Zorath, the alien species that ruled this system, had kept their distance. Their technology was advanced, but they were known for their strange neutrality in the ongoing galactic war. The Zorath never allied with anyone, choosing instead to remain isolated, watching the chaos from afar. It was said that their power didn't lie in weapons or armies, but in their ability to manipulate the minds of others. That was why Captain Mara Jenkins had been sent to Nix. She was one of the finest diplomats in the fleet, trusted to negotiate with species that were often too dangerous to approach. She had a natural way of reading people and understanding their intentions. But the Zorath were different. They didn't think like humans, and that made them a mystery that Mara was eager to solve. The ship's intercom crackled to life. "Captain Jenkins, we're approaching the Zorath capital. The ambassador is ready to meet you." "Understood," Mara said, her voice calm but her heart racing. She turned to her team, her eyes scanning the faces of the officers who had worked with her for years. Each of them knew how important this mission was. Their success could mean peace, or it could mean something far worse. The Zorath had been silent for too long, and no one knew what they were capable of. Mara adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and walked toward the shuttle bay. The team followed her in silence, each of them aware of the gravity of the situation. The shuttle descended through the clouds of Nix, the world's surface hidden beneath a thick layer of mist. As they landed, the crew could see the towering spires of the Zorath city rising up ahead. The architecture was sleek and alien, unlike anything Mara had seen before. There were no visible weapons or guards, just a quiet, ominous stillness that seemed to breathe. The shuttle doors opened and the crew stepped out onto the soft green grass of a vast garden. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something floral and yet metallic at the same time. The Zorath were known for their advanced bioengineering, and Mara couldn't help but wonder if this garden was a product of their strange experiments. At the center of the garden stood a figure, tall and graceful. She was surrounded by an aura of calm, as if the very world bent around her presence. Her skin shimmered in the light, a pale blue that seemed to glow in the shadows of the mist. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, like the gaze of a predator that had learned to hide its hunger. But it was her smile that captured Mara's attention. It was subtle, but there was something dangerous about it, as though she knew a secret that no one else did. "Welcome, Captain Jenkins," the figure said, her voice like music, soft yet commanding. "I am Zara, ambassador of the Zorath. It is an honor to finally meet you." Mara extended a hand, trying to remain composed despite the unsettling feeling crawling up her spine. "The honor is mine, Ambassador Zara. We've heard much about your people. I look forward to discussing how we can work together." Zara's smile deepened, though it remained serene. "Of course, Captain, but before we talk, I must show you something." Without waiting for a response, Zara turned and beckoned Mara to follow. The group walked through the garden, Zara leading them deeper into the heart of the Zorath city. The plants here were unlike any Earth species, with vines that seemed to pulse with light and flowers that shifted colors as they passed. Mara's crew whispered among themselves, but their words were muted, almost as if the air itself had absorbed the sound. Mara couldn't help but wonder how the Zorath managed such a peaceful environment amidst a galaxy at war. Everything about this place felt both ancient and futuristic, as though time didn't have the same meaning here. They stopped at a large structure that looked like a floating temple, its edges curling up toward the sky like the petals of an enormous flower. The walls seemed to shimmer, reflecting the landscape in a way that distorted the view, making it impossible to tell where the building ended and the world began. Inside, the air was thick with a strange, soothing fragrance. The floor was made of a smooth black stone that gleamed like obsidian. At the center of the room was a large circular table, around which sat several other Zorath diplomats, their faces unreadable, their eyes glowing faintly. Mara felt an unease settle in her chest. The atmosphere was so serene, it was almost unnatural. "Please sit," Zara said, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. She gestured to the empty seats around the table, and Mara reluctantly sat down, feeling the weight of Zara's gaze on her. As the meeting began, Zara's smile never faltered. She spoke with such grace, her words carefully chosen to weave a web of diplomacy that Mara could almost feel tightening around her. Every sentence seemed designed to pull Mara in, to make her feel as though they were allies already, as though the fate of their people was already sealed in a shared vision. Mara listened intently, trying to stay focused on the conversation. But there was something about Zara that unsettled her. The more Zara spoke, the more Mara felt like the world around her was slipping away, like the room itself was fading into the background, leaving only Zara's voice and smile in focus. It was subtle at first. Mara dismissed it as nerves, but the longer she listened, the more the world outside the conversation seemed to disappear. Her thoughts grew foggy, and she found it harder to concentrate. She glanced around the room, but the faces of the other Zorath diplomats appeared distant, their features blurring as if they were fading into nothing. Zara's smile remained, and Mara's heart skipped a beat. There was something dangerous about it, something that made her wonder if she had stepped into a trap without even realizing it. But Mara tried to shake off the feeling. But every time she met Zara's eyes, the world around her seemed to blur a little more. It wasn't just the room. She could feel it in her own mind. Zara's influence was spreading, wrapping around her thoughts like a fine thread, slowly but surely pulling her deeper into a web she couldn't escape. Captain Mara Jenkins woke up with a start. The familiar hum of the Conqueror vibrated through the walls of her quarters. But something felt off. It wasn't the ship. It was her mind. The encounter with Zara and the Zorath had left a deep mark on her. The unsettling smile, the strange influence, had lingered in her thoughts, like an echo that refused to fade. Mara rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. She had been in many tense negotiations before, but never had she felt so powerless. She knew the Zorath were dangerous, but she hadn't expected this kind of psychological warfare. Zora's words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over. "You must understand, Captain. The Zorath have no need for war. We win through understanding, through control." Mara stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the swirling mist of Nyx below. The city, so peaceful and serene, hid its true nature behind an illusion. She had to be careful. She couldn't afford to lose herself in this place. The intercom buzzed, pulling Mara from her thoughts. "Captain Jenkins, Ambassador Zara is requesting another meeting. came the voice of her first officer, Lieutenant Carter. Mara hesitated. She knew she should refuse. She needed to gather her thoughts, regain control, but something inside her urged her to agree. The influence was subtle, but it was there. A soft tug, pulling her toward Zara, toward the Zorath. "Set it up," Mara said, her voice firm, though uncertainty lingered beneath. When Mara arrived at the Zorath embassy, the atmosphere was different than before. The garden, once vibrant and alive with color, now seemed muted, almost lifeless. The plants still pulsed with light, but the air felt heavier, more suffocating. As she walked toward the center of the garden, Mara noticed that the Zorath were no longer in their usual calm state. The diplomats who had greeted her so warmly now seemed distant, their expressions unreadable. At the far end of the garden stood Zara. She was alone this time, her eyes fixed on Mara as if waiting for her arrival. The dangerous smile was still there, but now it seemed more like a challenge. Zara didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was enough to make Mara's heart race. "Captain Jenkins," Zara said, her voice as smooth as ever, "I am glad you could join me today." Mara nodded, but the words felt empty in her mouth. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The world around her seemed to shift in subtle ways, as if the very air was being manipulated. The Zorath had power beyond what anyone had imagined. "I've been thinking," Zara continued, stepping closer, "about your people. Humans are unpredictable. You are capable of great things, but you are also fragile. It's that fragility that makes you so fascinating." Mara stiffened. There was something cold in Zara's tone, something that didn't sit right. But she couldn't tell if it was a threat or an invitation. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts scattered. She had to focus. "I understand you have a unique way of influencing others," Mara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we are not as easily controlled as you think." Zara's smile deepened, and for a moment, Mara felt a strange rush of dizziness. It was as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. She reached out for a nearby tree to steady herself, but Zara's voice stopped her. "You misunderstand, Captain," Zara said softly, her words cutting through the fog in Mara's mind. "I am not trying to control you. I am simply offering you a choice. Join us, and you will see the true power of the Zorath. Resist, and you will find yourself lost in a battle you cannot win." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mara's thoughts swirled, and for a moment she could see the appeal of Zara's offer. Power, control, peace. But then a small voice inside her pushed back. This wasn't right. She had to break free. "You want us to join you," Mara said, her voice growing stronger. "But what does that mean for humanity? Will we lose our identity? Will we become like you?" Zara's eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? "Humans cling to their identity because they fear losing it. It is the fear that holds you back. But if you let go, you will see the truth. You will become something more." Mara's heart raced. The power in Zara's words was undeniable. But deep down, she knew that if she gave in, if she allowed the Zorath to reshape her, she would lose everything that made her human. The thought terrified her. "I will not give up who I am," Mara said, her voice resolute. and I will not allow you to control my crew." Zara's smile faded, but there was no anger in her expression, only a strange sadness. "Very well," she said softly. "If you choose to resist, the consequences will be inevitable." Before Mara could respond, Zara turned and walked away, her steps silent on the soft grass. Mara watched her go, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She had made her choice, but the fight was far from over. Back aboard the Conqueror, Mara sat in her quarters, staring at the communication terminal. Her thoughts were in turmoil. She had made a decision, but the consequences were still unclear. Zara's influence was powerful, and Mara could feel it lingering in her mind like a shadow. She needed to regain control. She couldn't let the Zorath break her. Her first officer, Lieutenant Carter, entered the room without knocking. His expression was grim, his brow furrowed. "Captain, we've noticed something strange. The crew, they're acting different. Some of them are starting to forget things. Others are speaking as though they've been changed." Mara's heart sank. "How bad is it?" "We don't know yet, but it's spreading," Carter said, his voice tight. "We've isolated a few crew members who seem unaffected, but it's clear that whatever Zara is doing, it's getting worse." Mara clenched her fists. She had to act fast. If the Zorath were using their mental influence on the crew, she couldn't afford to let it spread. But how could she fight back when she didn't even fully understand what was happening? "We need to find a way to break Zara's hold on us," Mara said, her voice firm. "We can't let her win. We're not like the others. We're stronger than that." Carter nodded, but his eyes were full of doubt. "But how, Captain? How do we fight something we can't even see?" Mara's mind raced. There had to be a way, some weakness in Zara's power that they could exploit. She couldn't do this alone. She needed her crew, all of them, to stay strong. "We'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to Carter. "We'll find a way." But as she spoke, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that with each passing moment, she was losing herself just a little bit more to Zara's dangerous smile. Captain Mara Jenkins stood at the command center of the Conqueror, staring at the large display screen. The ship was still in orbit around Nyx, but the tension among the crew was rising with each passing day. The influence of the Zorath was spreading, creeping into the minds of her team like a silent infection. Even the ones who had been unaffected at first were beginning to show signs of change. The crew's thoughts were no longer their own. They were drifting, lost in a sea of doubt and confusion. Mara had always prided herself on her ability to read people. She was good at seeing through the facades, at understanding what drove others. But the Zorath were different. Zara's ability to influence minds was subtle, powerful, and far beyond anything Mara had ever encountered. But Mara wasn't just any diplomat. She was a human, a being capable of resilience and adaptability. And it was that very strength, that unique human edge, that she would have to use to fight back. "Captain, we need to talk," came the voice of Lieutenant Carter, breaking through her thoughts. Mara turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression serious. He had always been a reliable officer, someone she could trust. But even now, there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "What is it, Carter?" Mara asked, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. "It's getting worse," he said, stepping into the room. "The crew, They're not just forgetting things anymore. They're changing. Some of them don't even recognize themselves. It's like they're not the same people we once knew. Mara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The Zorath had a way of warping perception, making people question their own reality. It wasn't just a matter of influence. It was a matter of control. And that was something Mara couldn't allow. "How many are affected?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "At least half the crew, Captain," Carter replied. "We've been trying to isolate them, but it's spreading too fast. And it's not just physical. They're changing inside. Some of them have stopped questioning Zara's motives. Some are even following her orders without realizing it." Mara clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had known that the Zorath would be a threat, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't anticipated just how far they would go to control her crew. And now she was starting to feel it too. The pull, the temptation to give in, to accept Zara's offer of peace, was becoming harder to resist. But Mara refused to give in. She had to fight. For herself, for her crew, for humanity. "I need to talk to the unaffected crew members," Mara said, her voice firm. "We can't let this spread any further. We need to find a way to break Zara's hold on us." Carter nodded, his eyes full of concern. "Are you sure, Captain? We don't even know how she's doing this. We don't know what we're up against." Mara took a deep breath and turned toward the view screen again. "I know, Carter. But I've been thinking. The Zorath have power. No one doubts that. But they underestimate us. They underestimate humanity." "How do you mean?" Carter asked, confusion clear in his voice. Mara turned back to him, her eyes burning with determination. "The Zorath believe they can control us. They think that because we are unpredictable, we are weak. But that's our strength. Humanity's greatest strength is our ability to adapt, to resist, to change when we need to, but never lose who we are. That's why we can fight back. We can find a way to break free." Carter blinked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "So you think we can fight this? You think we can resist Zara's influence?" Mara nodded, her voice steady. "But we need to start by understanding how Zara's power works. We need to know her weaknesses, her limitations. And most importantly, we need to remember what makes us human. It's that spark inside us that can never be controlled. That's the edge we have." Later that day, Mara gathered the unaffected crew members in the ship's conference room. There were only a handful of them, those who had somehow managed to resist Zara's influence. Some were veterans, others were young officers who had shown exceptional mental fortitude in the past. But all of them had one thing in common. They were still themselves, still human. Mara stood at the front of the room, looking each of them in the eye. "We're facing something we don't fully understand," she began. "The Zorath have power beyond what we've ever seen, but we're not going to let them win. We're going to fight back, together." One of the crew members, Sergeant Walker, raised his hand. "How, Captain?" "How do we fight something we can't even see? We don't know what Zara is doing to us. I've been thinking about that, Mara said. Zara's power is psychological. It's about control. But what she doesn't understand is that humans don't think the same way the Zorath do. Our minds are more unpredictable. We don't follow patterns. We don't always do what's expected, and that's our advantage. Lieutenant Carter nodded in agreement. If we can disrupt her influence, if we can break the pattern she's trying to create, maybe we can regain control. Mara smiled. Exactly. The Zorath can't predict us. They can't control us unless we allow it. But we need to stay strong. We need to remember who we are, and we need to fight for each other. Another crew member, Ensign Miller, spoke up. But how do we start? How do we break free from her hold? Mara paused for a moment, then stepped forward, her voice low and determined. We start by refusing to give in. We remember our humanity. We don't let Zara define us. We won't be her puppets. The room was silent for a moment as the crew members absorbed her words. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded. The determination in their eyes was unmistakable. They weren't going to let the Zorath win. Not without a fight. Over the next few days, Mara and the crew worked together to form a plan. They began to isolate themselves from Zara's influence, staying away from the Zorath embassy and focusing on their human connections. They reminded each other of their strengths, their memories, their emotions, their ability to adapt. Slowly but surely, they began to regain control. But the Zorath were watching. Zara knew something was happening. She could feel the shift, the resistance building, and she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Mara knew the battle was far from over. The Zorath were powerful, but humanity had something that the Zorath could never understand, an unbreakable spirit. And it was that spirit that would carry them through. As Mara prepared for the next confrontation, she knew one thing for sure. The fight for her crew, for humanity, was just beginning. Captain Mara Jenkins stood in the command center of the Conqueror, her hands clenched at her sides. The time had come. The crew was ready, and they had made their decision. They were going to confront Zara, to break free from her influence once and for all. There was no turning back now. Every move they made had led them to this moment. It was the final stand. Mara had seen the way her crew had come together, how they had fought to stay true to themselves despite the overwhelming pressure from the Zorath. They had each found something inside of them, something that could not be controlled. It was that human spirit, unstoppable, unpredictable, and unyielding, that had kept them alive. But they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, the freedom of choice, the freedom to think, to feel, and to be who they were. They were fighting for humanity's future. "I'm ready," Lieutenant Carter said from the door, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. The rest of the crew stood behind him, their expressions firm, determined. They knew what was at stake. Mara nodded, taking one last look at the star system on the view screen. "We all are. Let's finish this." The Zorath embassy stood before them, silent and imposing. The city of Nyx was still, as if holding its breath. The gardens, once so vibrant, were now strangely quiet. It was almost as if the Zorath knew this was the moment when everything would change. Mara led the crew to the embassy, her steps resolute. As they entered the garden, Zara was already waiting for them, standing in the same spot where they had first met. Her eyes were fixed on Mara, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had been expecting them. "I knew you would come, Captain," Zara said, her voice calm and measured. "You think you can resist, but you don't understand. My power is not something you can simply walk away from. It is a part of you now." "You will never be free of it?" Mara's heart raced, but she stood tall. "You're wrong, Zara," she said, her voice unwavering. "We are human. We cannot be controlled. Not by you, not by anyone." Zara's smile widened. "We shall see, Captain." Zara raised her hand and the air around them seemed to shift. A strange pressure filled the space, and Mara felt a sudden wave of dizziness. It was like being underwater, heavy and disorienting. She could feel the pull of Zara's influence, the familiar tug in her mind, urging her to surrender. It was the same feeling she had experienced the first time they met, only now it was stronger, more intense. But this time, Mara was ready. She had been preparing for this moment, preparing her crew for this battle. The human edge they had discovered, the ability to resist, to adapt, to think outside of Zara's control, was their greatest weapon. They weren't going to let the Zorath win. "Focus, everyone," Mara commanded, her voice cutting through the fog in her mind. "Remember who we are. We are human. We are strong because we refuse to be controlled." The crew members stood firm, their eyes wide with determination. Slowly, they began to break free from the fog. The pressure that had once seemed so suffocating was now starting to lift, replaced by a sense of clarity. They were fighting back. Zara's smile faltered, just for a moment. "You think you can resist? You think you can beat me?" Her voice was sharp now, full of disbelief. "I control the very fabric of your thoughts. You cannot win." But Mara's resolve only strengthened. "You may control our thoughts, Zara, but you cannot control our hearts. We are not machines. We are not slaves. We are free." The air around them shifted once more, this time in a wave of pure defiance. The pressure from Zara's influence began to fade, replaced by the strength of Mara and her crew's will. They were pushing back, rejecting Zara's control. The Zorath's power was real, but it had limits. And those limits were being reached. Zara's eyes narrowed, and she raised both hands now, her power flaring up in a brilliant, blinding light. The garden around them trembled, and the ground beneath their feet began to crack. For a moment, Mara thought they might all be consumed by the energy. But then something unexpected happened. The crew, united by their humanity, began to stand taller, their faces filled with resolve. They were fighting back, not with power, but with will. Mara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Zara. "We've learned something that you'll never understand, Zara. We don't need to control everything. We don't need to bend others to our will. We are strong because we fight for each other. We are strong because we are free." The words rang through the air like a bell, clear and pure. And in that moment, something inside Zara seemed to crack. The intense energy that had been building around them started to dissipate. Zara's power, which had seemed so unstoppable, began to falter. "You," Zara whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You cannot be controlled." "Not by me. Not by anyone." "That's right," Mara said firmly. "We are human. We are unpredictable. And that is our greatest strength." With a final, defiant step, Mara reached out and placed her hand on Zara's. The energy that had once surrounded them both surged, but this time it was Mara's resolve, her will, that held the power. Zara's influence faltered, slipping away like sand through fingers. Zara's smile was gone now, replaced by a look of confusion and defeat. "How?" she asked, her voice soft, almost sad. "Because we refuse to be what you want us to be," Mara said, her voice steady. "We refuse to give up who we are." The last of Zara's power shattered, dissipating into the air like smoke. The garden fell silent, and the weight that had hung over them for so long finally lifted. The crew stood together, their faces filled with relief and triumph. They had done it. They had broken free. As the sun began to set over Nyx, Mara stood at the edge of the garden, looking out at the stars. The mission had been a success. The Zorath had been defeated, not by force or power, but by the strength of the human spirit. They had proven that no matter how powerful their enemies were, they could never break the one thing that made them human: their ability to choose their own path. Behind her, the crew gathered, their faces weary, but filled with pride. They had fought together, and they had won. They were free. "Captain," Lieutenant Carter said, his voice filled with respect, "we did it. We really did it." Mara nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, we did. And we'll keep fighting for each other." For humanity, the stars above twinkled brightly, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit would always find a way to shine.